Hello everyone, welcome to our July coffee break integrating with Splunk, New Relic, Solarwinds and more, hosted by our technical services manager, Adam. My name's Rosie and I'm the community lead here at Squared Up. Before we begin, I just wanted to let you know of our new community roundup I'll be sending out at the end of each month, which is a collection of the latest SCOM, Azure Monitor and Squared Up news. We'll also share the latest posts from our community answers site and news of upcoming events we'll be attending later this year, a few of which include Microsoft Ignite and Experts Live Europe in November. So if you're there, do come and say hello. I'm planning to send it out to the community tomorrow, and it will also feature on our blog, so please do check that out if you have a minute. And with that, I'll hand you over to Adam. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosie. So welcome everyone to today's session. Like Rosie said, we're going to be talking about integrating with a number of external tools to bring a bit of context to your SCOM data for wider audiences. So we're going to start by basically just recapping how we can do that within Squared Up. We have a number of tiles that you can use on dashboards, and I'm going to be sort of working through a few of those, some common scenarios. But we'll start with just talking about why integrations are typically useful to the business. So SCOM can't do everything. We're all aware of that. So typically when people are certainly in the sort of like a modern world where people are migrating to the cloud, there are native capabilities in. So Azure Monitor is a great example. And for certain services in Azure, that may be a better option for you. Obviously, APM is a very big topic as well, and we have covered this in the past on a previous coffee break episode. So looking at tools that are specifically designed to monitor apps sort of at code level, inside out, usually in a sort of higher capacity than SCOM can do it. Real-time monitoring is also something that SCOM doesn't really do. We all know that, sort of polling intervals, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, that kind of thing. And quite often for sort of core business apps, you want to see what's happening as it's happening. Sometimes you just want to monitor things from multiple locations using multiple tools, again, for business critical apps, just to make sure that you're not getting false positives or that kind of thing. And outside in is a very common scenario. Also, so looking at your apps from your user's perspective, from around the world, from different data centers, that kind of thing. And sort of finally, and sort of touching on the DevOps and native cloud platforms piece as well, is there isn't a SCOM agent for everything. Some apps, some components of apps will need to be monitored using different tools depending on sort of how they've been built. So we all, I'm sure, everyone on the coffee break today, I'm sure everyone has more than SCOM in their environment and bringing in data. The key to making monitoring successful is often ensuring that users are engaged with your sort of monitoring strategy. And if you can layer data from all these other tools into the same environment to create the single pane of glass, then more the better. So we're just basically going to talk about the tools that were mentioned in the title, plus a few others, but from the point of view of how you can use Squared Up to access that data. So I'm using these, like I said, as an example, but these could be any tools that you have in your environment. It doesn't have to just be these. We'll cover a sort of small amount of technical detail on sort of how to do it. And if you have any further questions, obviously feel free to ask through the chat or get in touch with support@squaredup.com. So the first topic we're going to cover is the SQL tile. It comes in two flavors, so either returning a grid of data or scalar results, so a number, using SQL queries. We're going to be talking about the API tile, which again is grid or scalar based. And finally, the web content tile, so give it a URL for some external site or some HTML that it can render directly, and you can bring all that extra data into your dashboards natively. So let's start by talking about the SQL tile. So it authenticates using the Squared Up application pool identity, which, like it says, makes AD-based access to your database is really simple. Whatever your application pool is running as, be it a network service or a custom identity, if everything is in the same Active Directory domain, then you can use the app pool's identity to authenticate with that external database. So like I said, with any SQL database, all you need to do for the tile is basically give it a connection string and the query, and using the familiar language, and you're done, basically. So if you have a query that you often run in SQL Server Management Studio that gives you some reporting, you can drop that into a SQL tile and you'll get your results in a dashboard on demand in Squared Up. Mustache can also be used, so that's our sort of placeholder sort of language, so that you can inject dynamic content into those queries. So for static dashboards, very simple, just give it a query. If you want to use the SQL tile on perspectives, though, you probably want those perspectives to be unique to the object that you're looking at. So you can modify the query to use our dynamic placeholders to populate them. The next area to cover, and I'll go into a demo just after I've sort of outlined these tiles. The WebAPI tile is very similar to the SQL tile. In that it can bring in data in a sort of table or scalar format from, and just to emphasize, most JSON RESTful APIs, not all, but most. And if you do have any questions on that, feel free to ask through the chat. You configure the provider within Squared Up. So we're not using Active Directory out of the box. We're not using the application pool identity to authenticate here. You're going to configure the API connector within Squared Up itself, and that's stored in an encrypted file on disk on your Squared Up server. Squared Up acts like a typical API client in that respect. So if you have queries that you can run in PowerShell or that you can run in Postman, chances are you'll be able to translate those to a tile in Squared Up. It's important to note as well, in the same sort of vein as the SQL tile, queries through the API tile are written using the syntax of that endpoint that you're connecting to. It's not Squared Up specific. So if you're connecting to New Relic versus Solarwinds, chances are they're going to be very different in terms of their configuration, different authentication methods, probably different query syntax. But again, the vendors are obviously very geared up to help you with things like that. And it's incredibly rare that I find a situation online where I can't find an API reference guide that will help me configure an API tile in Squared Up. Finally, we'll touch on the web content tile as well. So it's a nice simple way. You can just drop a URL in and it will basically render that website inside an iframe. You can also drop blocks of HTML and CSS into there directly. So if you have a little widget or an applet that you normally show on in SharePoint or something like that, chances are you'll probably be able to drop it into a Squared Up dashboard. And again, Mustache can be used in this tile as well. So for URLs that take you to something on a perspective, you can typically use some of those SCOM object properties to make the content dynamic. So we'll flick over to a quick demo, and we will start with, we'll take a look at some Solarwinds data first. So within Squared Up, within technical services, we're responsible for internal systems. And so we have a few tools that we use outside of SCOM. So we'll jump over to this core network dashboard. So this is just a very simple status dashboard to give us an overview of the hardware that we run on-prem here in our office in Maidenhead. I've made it look a little bit prettier than perhaps you'd get out of the box, and I'll cover sort of how that's done. But very simply, to start this off, I opened up SQL Server Management Studio, connected to the relevant SQL server, and built into the SolarWinds Orion database is a number of really useful views. And just by running the select top 1,000 rows, that kind of thing, you get an example query that you can take and drop straight into Squared Up. So if we have a quick look at this tiles configuration, we start by providing a connection string. So in this case, the SQL server that we're using is OPP SQL 01, and the database is SolarWinds Orion. It's important to take note of the trusted connection equals yes. You can, in your environment, if necessary, set that to trusted connection equals no, and also specify credentials to connect. We do not recommend that because that data is just being stored in plain text in the dashboard's configuration. But if you have no option and the dashboard has very limited audience, then it is, of course, possible to do that. So like I said, after you've specified a connection string, the query pane basically lets you just drop in a query. And this, if I was to drop it into SQL Server Management Studio connected to this database, I would get the exact same results you're seeing here in Squared Up. So I'm selecting a number of columns from the table and from the nodes database. And because I know all of our on-prem infrastructure is prefixed with the name int-unify, it's all Ubiquiti Unify equipment, I've just used a simple where to filter, and then I've sorted it by IP address so that it sort of meets the the needs of my OCD. So we end up with a dashboard that's showing some useful information. We can see what the device is, when it was last rebooted. And then obviously, I'm sure your attention's been very quickly drawn to these lovely columns containing images. These are done, this can be done in basically any table in Squared Up, just using simple functions to override the columns. So for example, last boot, if we just go into edit, this is a very common little sort of JavaScript function that's built into Squared Up. It will take a string in various time formats and convert it into a time ago. So if I was to take that out, you'll see we go back to a Unix timestamp, which isn't very useful, obviously. So put the value back in, and we get this nice sort of placeholder value. So looking at these other columns, we'll go to the sort of pretty ones. So status, for example, by default, the query will return whatever is in the SQL table. And in this case, when something is healthy, it says node status is up. When something's in warning state, it says node status is warning. So I've used just a little bit of code, a little sort of if and else statement to basically say, if the node is up, use this image instead of the text. And again, just to sort of prove that point, if I cut it out, there we go, sort of back to basic text. It's fine for, a dashboard that you're looking at on your desktop, but if you want to have things up on wall screens, that kind of stuff, sometimes you do want them to be a bit more sort of visually appealing, and this sort of stuff is a really easy way to do it. Again, we cover some of this kind of functionality in our custom labeling article, so feel free to check out support.squaredup.com, or again, just ask questions if you want to. The way I've replaced the vendor with the image is exactly the same, so it's just using an if the vendor is Ubiquiti, replace it with ubiquiti.png, and those images are just hosted on my Squared Up server in a folder called images. So that's a really simple way. This dashboard is static, so whenever this dashboard is viewed, you will always see the same results. Whether, if I drop this query into a perspective, regardless of what the object was I was looking at, I will always see this result. And for perspectives, that's obviously not necessarily desirable. Just before I show you a perspective, I'll just quickly call out a feature that is really powerful in Squared Up, but isn't often used, that we've seen too much, is the ability to create a task button. So within Squared Up, if you hit the lightning bolt, you can define actions. And in this case, I've got a simple action. If I just go out of edit mode, when I click it, it's just going to jump me straight out to my SolarWinds Orion homepage. Really simple and really nice way to sort of link the tools together. So if you're presenting some sort of overview information in Squared Up, you can jump straight out to the tool. The other feature that's really useful in these sorts of dashboards is the row linking functionality, and I'll just very quickly sort of show you that as well. So on the final, the grid options pane, you can basically drop in any URL. If it's just a complete URL, any line that you click on will take you to that location. But in this case, I'm using mustache syntax to take a property from each of these results, which is known as alert object ID in the database. And as a result, when I now click on any of these, it will jump me again to that URL and inject that property right at the end. That mustache can, of course, be anywhere in the URL to suit the system that you're connecting to. And again, it can be any property that's being pulled back by that SQL query. In this case, object ID is this number on the end. That's the unique part. So that's what I've chosen to add into my row link. So if we move on to a perspective now, so let's jump over to our trusty sales app, and we will take a look at the alert history perspective. So this one is actually querying the data warehouse for SCOM. So this isn't necessarily an external tool, but it's a nice way to sort of highlight using dynamic content in queries. So again, I could have this as a dashboard where I would specify everything sort of manually, but if we take a look at the query that's populating this tile, I won't go through all the SQL. I'm not an expert. I can just about get by with a bit of help from Google, but in this case, it's very clear to see we're using a dynamic property for ID in here. So that's basically taking the object ID for this enterprise application and passing it into the query. And what the query is then doing is it's basically looking for all of the objects that make up this enterprise agreement, this enterprise application. And it is then pulling back an account of, in this case, critical alerts, warning alerts. They're duplicated for some reason, 7 days versus 30 days. And again, this table works exactly the same. So if I was to look at this perspective for any other enterprise application, the query will take the ID for that application versus this one, and the tiles will populate based on that the object that you're looking at. Again, this is a sort of a custom perspective that's been built, but don't be afraid to obviously edit anything that comes out of the box in Squared Up. So, for example, on the sort of like the first perspective you see for the sales app, I've embedded this. Again, it's just using the very similar SQL query I was just looking at for the SolarWinds nodes view, the network view. But in this case, it's pulling back alerts that are relevant to this application from Server and Application Monitor, one of the SolarWinds Orion Suite components. So yeah, setting up these tiles is very simple. Typically, you'll want to start in SQL Server Management Studio. You'll want to write a query that gives you the right results. For performance, it's obviously best to only return the data you want. So as an example, that the network table contains about 50 columns that contain all sorts of data. I don't need to sort of burden Squared Up by returning all of that. So I've specified specifically the columns I want. They may not all be in view on your dashboard. For example, on this alerts view dashboard, I'm not showing the alert ID, but I need to pull that back so that I can use a row link. I need to have the ID somewhere within this tile so that I can reference it when I set up my row link. And again, just clicking on it sort of takes you to the result. Just to sort of show you a very simple way of using the mustache helper. If we take a look in this, again, like I said, alert object ID is what I've chosen, but just by clicking the dynamic value button, this is basically going to show me what each field is that's available within this tile, all the fields that I've asked to be returned from the database, and it will show me the values that are for those. So it's very easy to see that alert object ID is the variable that I want in this case. So we will now move on from the SQL tile, and we'll talk a little bit about the API tile. So unlike SQL, where we're using the app pool to authenticate with those remote SQL servers, within Squared Up, you want to configure your API providers here through the hamburger menu and then System Web API. When you click Add New Provider, there are a number of options to choose from. Simple is, well, as it sounds, it's very simple. You're basically giving Squared Up a URL. You can choose to ignore SSL errors or not. And then you want to specify headers. Before we introduced the basic auth type, you would commonly find in here an authorization header with basic and then just a sort of base 64 encoded string. And that would be how you would use sort of non-auth based APIs. Since we added the basic auth type, you can specify a username and password in here, and we do the conversion work on the fly, and we store that base 64 encoded string. Again, it's very easy to unencrypt those strings. So whenever you're sort of creating things, you can just rest assured that all of these providers are stored in an encrypted file. So it is impossible to get the data back. For sort of more, I guess, modern RESTful APIs, auth might be your option. And again, there are a number of different grant types, and there are unfortunately, many different standards within auth for authorization. So we obviously can't win them all, but we do our best. So these are typically the most common ones that we would find. And again, you're going to rely on the vendor's API documentation in order to figure out which is the correct grant type to use. So be it client credentials with an ID and secret, authorization scope, that kind of stuff. Perhaps it's just a username and password that you specify. But again, like I said, the vendor of the tool that you're connecting to is best placed to help you with that. And yeah, like I said, in my experience, it's very rare to find any sort of modern RESTful API without really good interactive online documentation. We also have a number of Azure connectors. So if you want to connect to the Graph API, Office API, things like that, you want to connect to App Insights or Log Analytics to bring data in from your sort of cloud resources. Again, that's all configured through the Web API providers settings area. So once you've configured your provider, and just to sort of highlight sort of the way that we do things here, we have quite a number of providers set up: ServiceNow, PagerDuty, New Relic. We'll cover sort of the content that we get through those in just a few minutes. Set up your providers, and then once they're set up, you're ready to start adding Web API tiles to your dashboards. So let's go with a trusted classic. We'll take a look at this sort of master ServiceNow dashboard. So in this case, we're using the ServiceNow provider with OAuth that we configured before. And these tiles, obviously you can see there's a mix of the scalar and the grid. And again, when I hover, you can see down right in the very bottom left, the URL, and these are row linked. It will take you to the record for this entry. If we take a quick look at some of the configuration, that's very simple. We do actually have this this particular integration really well documented and a few other videos about it. So I won't go into too much detail here. But if we take a look at headers and data, for example, we're passing a few parameters through. So we specify a provider as ServiceNow. This is a get, so we're not posting anything. We're just asking for this particular API endpoint, stats/incident. And then we're passing through these parameters. There's nothing dynamic here. So like I said, this will always just return the total number, in this case, of active incidents that are open within ServiceNow. If you want to customize this little bit of text just to highlight what the number actually is, that's you do it from this last point here, and you can specify whatever you want in there. The more text you add, the sort of more it sort of misaligns. So sort of keep that in mind. And again, you can specify the font size of the number as well, if it's too big or too small, that kind of thing. So all of these tiles are, like I said, they're all very similar. They're configured using the same provider. In this case, we're connecting to a different endpoint, that being table/incident instead of stats, because we're asking for grid-based data. And again, this is all available through ServiceNow's API documentation. And again, I'm not signed into ServiceNow just right now, but you can see, for example, it's taken this incident number, which is being returned by the original query, and it's stuck it onto the end of the URL to take us to the right place. In this case, the row linking is actually set up incorrectly, hence it not going anywhere. Just a couple of other sort of examples. If we take a look, we've recently had a few queries about PagerDuty, which is a really nice external tool for actually acting on sort of alerts. It's really useful, obviously, to have a tool like SquaredUp sort of showing you, being able, a troubleshooting tool, being able to see alerts, that kind of thing. But if it's the middle of the night, you kind of, in most cases, will need something that also will wake you up and get you to look at things. PagerDuty is being used by a number of our customers, hence us sort of looking into it. So in this case, it's just exactly the same. It's an API. It's obviously a very different set of queries. It's a different endpoint. It's a different API. So again, we're sending totally different things. We're then digging into one of the returned objects called incidents in order to pull back this list. But again, this API is actually really nice for making row links, because one of the values it returns is actually the URL for that page that you're looking at. So you can just very simply use use nothing but mustache in this case, and it will always be correct based on the row that you click on. So we have, like I said, quite a few that we use at SquaredUp. Pingdom is a great tool for sort of outside-in monitoring. Again, nice broken dashboard that was working 5 minutes ago, but maybe a quick refresh. No, that's fine. So anyway, this is just a simple dashboard. We have about 10 working checks within Pingdom, and again, they're for different tools. So we check squaredup.com from 4 different locations around the world. We ping our head office gateway to make sure it's up. That's where VPN traffic comes in when people are working out of the office. And just because we had one test left in our allowance, we're monitoring, I think, smtp.office365.com for its response time as well. Obviously, it's a business critical system for us. So making these top level dashboards is really sort of nice and easy. Again, we can do this on a perspective. So if we just jump over to, let's say, one of the web servers in the sales app, we'll just have a quick look at how we integrate with Splunk. So if we take a look at this perspective here, this is just to sort of highlight passing dynamic data through. So with the last major release of SquaredUp, we introduced a feature that makes scoping API tiles to sort of sets of objects easier. So in the context of an enterprise application, the sales app, for example, contains about 10 different servers, rather than sort of, it's not possible to sort of manually specify using the mustache picker all of the individual servers within an enterprise application, but using this new feature that we added, it can sort of build that list for you. So that's why the WebAPI Tile now contains this scope option. So if I was to scope this as an example to server 2016 logical disks, rather than passing through the name of the server in the query, we'd be able to instead pass through the name of the disk. In this case, we're just relying on just some nice and simple mustache to do it, because it's just for one object. Splunk's API, by default, if you use the get method, you're basically just asking Splunk to perform a query, but it doesn't return the data. It just returns the ID of that query. And we can't do sort of joined up queries yet. We can't do one and then initiate another. So they have a very helpful feature where if you post instead and you use this execution mode called one shot, it'll run the query and it'll give you the results all in one go. So in this case, the search query that we're using, and again, if I was to copy and drop that straight into Splunk, it would obviously replacing display name with the server's actual real name. This is in Splunk's own query language. So if you're familiar with Splunk, you don't need to learn anything new to be able to do this in squared up. So in this case, we're passing a few variables through. We're asking it to return JSON, which is what we require for the API tile. I only want 10 results back because it's sort of like a summary of the latest alerts. And again, this is all documented on support.squaredup.com. The results that come back are stored in blocks, and results is the key path we want to jump into. And then again, I can customize columns. All I want in this case is the time and message. And just like on my other dashboard, I've applied time ago to this particular value that's coming back from the query. So I'm getting, rather than a timestamp, I'm getting a date instead. And under message, the data it's returning is sort of too long and it makes my dashboard not look particularly great. It sort of all goes a bit wrong. So instead, I'm applying another little JavaScript function for substring. So I'm basically saying, show me characters 0 through 200. And when I reapply that, I get a nice sort of summary result. And if I wanted to, I could then obviously go into Splunk and investigate this further, or connect to the machine using some other tool. Splunk is a very sort of common tool that we get asked about through support. So again, if you are interested in it, we have done quite a lot of work on this, and support.squaredup.com, as well as previous episodes of the Coffee Break, have plenty of technical detail on how to integrate with this. So we've covered the SQL tile on dashboards and perspectives. We've covered the API tile on dashboards and perspectives. Again, feel free to ask questions at any point if you want any more information. The team is online to sort of help you out. The final part that we're just going to talk about is using the WebAPI tile, the web content tile. So this is a really simple way of getting external data into Squared Up. So if you already have a website you look at for something, it can be external. It may not be something that's sort of internal to you. Maybe it's the weather, who knows? But you can use the web content tile to bring that data in. So if we jump back to the sales app, and we will just take a look at the availability perspective. So out of the box, this perspective just contains sort of summary data for the availability test that's being run by SCOM, and the response time as measured by the SCOM management server, or whichever server it is that you're using to monitor to actually run that test. So we can see here there have been some periods of sort of quite high response times, and the app has actually been reported as offline over the last 3 hours. It's currently healthy. With just those two pieces of information, it's not actually sort of overly clear what's going on. But in this case, we're using the web content tile to bring in some sort of shared embeddable graphs from New Relic. So New Relic is a really great APM tool that we just use it for demonstration purposes here. But in this case, we have the New Relic agent deployed on all of the servers in the sales app. It's configured and running sort of per their best practices. So hopefully this is the kind of thing that you would see. And if we just go into edit on this perspective, we can show you that it's a web content tile. It's hit next. It's just specifying it was specifying a URL. It's changed because I've changed the tile type. But again, this is just a link that was provided by New Relic when I told it I wanted to be able to embed that dashboard. And then under display, I can choose how high how many pixels high the tile is, whether I want to zoom in or out. If it's a long page, maybe I want to enable scrolling, maybe I want to show a border, that kind of stuff. It's all nice and simple, so I obviously won't save those changes. But all it's doing is every time the dashboard loads, we're just pulling New Relic and pulling this back. And it's fully interactive, so it's not just an image in sort of like open access style. In this case, this is a live piece of content coming from New Relic that I can sort of interact with. And just to sort of add a little bit of extra context to this availability dashboard, I also have a summary being shown from Pingdom. So the sales app is being tested again from sort of 4 locations around the world. and we're using an HTTP check. We're not checking IPv6. Again, there's lots of rich data you can bring back, but you can quite easily see sort of when the last test was and how long the response time was. And normally it sits relatively low, as you can sort of see in this graph. There obviously is something affecting end user performance. It's not quite failing the availability check, but it is obviously affecting user experience. And again, we can have, rather than just little snippets sort of embedded into other places, we do have a sort of dedicated New Relic perspective that's bringing things like the AppDex score, which is still very high, but it's obviously suffering somehow. We're bringing back things from New Relic's infrastructure agent about application CPU. And again, we're just making sort of really nice contextual perspectives that, again, can all be role-linked. So this will jump us out to New Relic, and we'll be looking at this particular website, at this particular web server. We'll obviously be able to browse around and see a bit more information. The world's your oyster, really, when it comes to sort of bringing in data. If you can view it online, chances are you'll be able to find some method of sort of bringing it into Squared Up. The sort of final part of the web content tile that I just wanted to highlight is, if I just create a new one before I show you the sort of grand finale, is rather than specifying a URL, you can just drop blocks of HTML in here. It doesn't support JavaScript, but you can use CSS. So like I said, if you have nice widgets deployed in other sort of tools, you can just drop them into Squared Up. And just to sort of highlight that, if we go back to our sales app, I had our web team very hard at work doing some amazing CSS work here. So you'll spot here. This is obviously not coming from SCOM. It's not coming online. This is all being rendered within Squared Up. The web team were going to try and get this hooked up so that the health state would change the message, but on short notice, this is the best they could do. But I'm very impressed with the train. And again, this is all just to sort of give you an idea of what you really can do with this. There is a huge amount of CSS defined in this and a bit of HTML that actually makes it happen at the end. So yeah, if you have sites internally, you can drop the source straight into tiles and we'll actually show them for you straight inside Squared Up. The other half of this perspective is obviously showing this application specifically, so sort of live preview, and again, everything's interactive. So it's a really nice tool to be able to actually sort of work with things. So that's the end of the demo. I'm just going to finish off with a couple of quick sort of tips and tricks, some things that I've sort of touched on through the demo and earlier in the presentation. So sort of how to achieve the best results and create awesome dashboards for your user base. Getting engagement is always hard, so I think the more you can do, maybe not as far as an animated train, but there are plenty of sort of things you can do to make your sort of SCOM data a little bit more appealing outside of the sort of core monitoring team. It's important to remember vendor documentation is the king. So just to reiterate, our tiles are effectively just clients. So no different to using Postman or PowerShell or whatever to connect to a web API. The API tile itself is sort of very resilient. You're basically giving it configuration from another tool. And if things aren't working, always feel free to reach out to ask us. But at the same time, it's worth contacting the vendor of that tool to ask them for some assistance, because the API was designed by them and they are best placed to sort of help you out with specific queries. Our lab is obviously only as big as it can be. We don't have access to everything. But yeah, what we do have, we're very happy to help you out with. Dynamic queries require a level of consistency across platforms. So if that doesn't make sort of sense off the bat, it's just to sort of highlight that when you're using Mustache, you're able to pass through effectively SCOM object properties. So for that pingdom perspective to work, just as an example, I've tagged the checks in pingdom with the SCOM object ID of the enterprise application. So when I'm querying pingdom and bringing back that table showing the 4 lines with the 4 different web tests, that's being filtered to only show web tests where the EA's SCOM ID is present as a tag. And most APIs will support some level of filtering or referencing based on other properties. So as long as you have some data that's consistent across platforms, New Relic allows you to define custom sort of key value pairs. So I have one called EAM ID, and the value of it is just the SCOM object ID. So again, I can create dynamic dashboards using SCOM object IDs in other tools. It doesn't have to be the SCOM object ID. It can be anything. It can be the display name. If that's already consistent, you've probably already overcome that sort of first hurdle. But otherwise, it's really key to sort of understand how you can structure data on both sides of the equation so that you can join them together. What works in PowerShell, I sort of reiterated this a minute ago. If you've got a SQL query or an API query that you can run in PowerShell or Postman or SSMS, it will almost always work in squared up. There are small caveats where maybe the API type isn't supported, maybe the authentication method doesn't work, that kind of thing. PowerShell is very flexible, as is Postman. We're always working to improve these tiles and features. So if you do have things where they do work in Postman, but you just can't get them to work, do reach out to us and we'll see what we can do. Making things compelling, again, is all part of that engagement piece, and a grid of data, sort of a full sort of HD screen full of data, just in plain text can look a bit dull. So using column overrides, like I showed at the beginning, if you can go for sort of colored status icons or anything like that, again, reach out to us if you want some help with that. But yeah, using image replaces and stuff is a sort of cheap way of making these otherwise sort of monolithic dashboards look quite nice. Keep in mind that RBAC doesn't apply. So what I mean by that is you can only view data in squared up, SCOM data in squared up rather, if your SCOM role allows it. If a user doesn't have access to see, let's say, the sales app in our environment, they obviously wouldn't be able to get to all of the perspectives for the sales app, and therefore RBAC does sort of protect us a little bit in that case. But if you have a top-level dashboard that everyone can see, and it's querying some external tool using credentials that you've either set through the app pool identity for SQL or through a web API provider, RBAC will not apply unless you put that dashboard inside a team folder, that kind of thing, in which case only authorized users can see it. Something I didn't actually put on this slide, but it is worth knowing as well. Dynamic content doesn't play very well with open access. So if you have a dashboard that contains, for example, an animated train, it's obviously not going to look particularly great on a sort of static capture of that dashboard. In some cases, those tiles won't load at all. So it's worth keeping that in mind, that this is really good for sort of interactive wall screens, that kind of stuff, but only in sort of contexts where it's sort of quite static data. You're not looking at things that are animated. You're not looking at things that refresh too quickly, that kind of stuff. So keep that in mind, but do experiment, and again, reach out to us if you need any help. And again, the community, as Rosie mentioned at the beginning, we have a large community through community.squaredup.com. Chances are there are many companies just like yours out there who use the same tools as you, whereas we're a software development company. We don't use many of these tools sort of in production. So it's always worth asking a question if you need help through community.squaredup.com. And again, use it as a means to talk about the things that you have achieved rather than necessarily just asking for questions. Feel free to write articles and send them to us. We're very happy to take contributions for our blog, that kind of thing. So do get in touch if you have done some really cool integrations and you would like to sort of feature them for your peers. So that's it for today's session. Just to sort of highlight a few resources. So again, community.squaredup.com. If you go to squaredup.com/coffee-break-series, you can sign up for future sessions. So if you have any colleagues you think that this might appeal to, feel free to send them the link and get them to sign up. We'll publish the slides and the recording for this via our blog, and of course all the video content goes into our YouTube channel. I won't attempt to read out that link, but feel free to search for Squared Up on YouTube, and you'll find a number of playlists, one of which is for the coffee break. So I'll put myself on mute just for a minute, and we'll see if we have any questions to cover. If not, thank you for joining us today, and hope that you can join us next time. Thanks a lot.